And let's get back now to the story, because let's follow the storyline here and get back to the rulers. And I want to jump through time a little bit now and jump to another place in time. So let's take a look at this for what it is. For us to do that, let's move forward in time. Let's move forward kind of far, because the same thing is playing out. And as we move into the future, we're going to see the same thing playing out. As a matter of fact, this same thing is playing out today. Of course, we're not going to go to today. We will before this little story is over, but we're going to go to a different time. So, let's jump to a time that is near and dear to all of our hearts if we are from the Western world, whether that be America or Canada or any of these places that have been influenced by the Western world. Let's jump to the Roman Empire. This thing went on for centuries. After that was the Dark Ages. But let's jump to that time, the Roman Empire, because that was a heavily influential empire. A lot of good came out of it, but it was a very powerful empire. And you'll notice that as it fractured and fell away over the last couple of centuries of its existence, people were just dumb, stupid. They couldn't read, they couldn't write, they couldn't do anything. It was just because that empire had fractured. You see, that was sort of, they had roads, they had buildings, they had concrete, they had baths, they stayed clean, they ate healthy. It was, their minds were warped, mind you. That was the sort of the dark side of that kind of thing. But there was a lot of good that came out of the Roman Empire as well. And I know that seems like a very, very long time ago and very, very difficult to relate to, because, the Roman Empire, that was a long time ago. A lot of the traditions came out of, and these are still traditions going on to this day, came out of the Mediterranean area and that Roman Empire as it was back then. Another thing that came out of that area and the Roman Empire as it was back then was this guy Jesus Christ was born in that area. And since we live in the Western world and we picked up this tradition, let's do a little bit of talking on this. I don't want to get too far into it, because then your mind will start slipping into religion, and I don't want our thing filled with dogma or doctrine or anything like that. Let's leave the ideologies at the door while we're listening to this, okay? So let's take a look at this too. So let's jump to that time period. Now we're in the Roman Empire. Hail Caesar and all that stuff you see in the movies. The Roman Empire had lots of trade going on. There was lots of money floating into Rome. There was lots of money being bartered. And the influences they had on regular folks' lives, like regular we the people, was massive. It truly was, because they brought a lot of technology and a lot of different ways of living. That life was actually better in some ways. However, they were a conquering empire, one of these people that are, we want to control, we control everything, you belong to us, and shut up, slave, that sort of idea. And, you can never forget that. We still have that same thing today. It's just, it takes a different form. But they brought a lot of influences to the time period, and it really did make a big difference in the world at that time. So this we cannot forget as we're looking at our story here. But as you look at that time period, and this is where we're going to bring up Jesus Christ, as you look at that time period, you'll see a lot of things were going on, and you will see that the world was about to come into a sort of a different time frame. And out of all the time frames that guy Jesus was born in, he happened to be born in that one. Now we're in the Western world, and these are our traditions. So I'm going to say things that if you grew up in China, it may not make any sense to you. If you grew up in some other place like, the jungles of Africa or something, it might not make any sense to you. But these are traditions of the Western world. So I'm going to say things because that's who I'm talking to when I'm talking about this part of the story. I'm talking to people with some rough understanding of these traditions, these Western traditions, and they did come out of the Roman Empire. So if any of this part seems like you're not following it and you didn't grow up in the Western tradition, that's probably why. I mean, if you think about it, is there even one Chinese person in the whole of the Bible? No. But were the Chinese people flourishing like crazy thousands and thousands of years? Of course they were. Of course they were. Was there one North American Indian in the whole of the Bible? No. But were they flourishing like crazy? Of course. Of course. See, so we can't let the dogma and the doctrine and all, because, believe it or not, people, this is part of how we ended up in this problem we're in right now, because we let this dogma and doctrine creep into us, and well, I'll say no more about that. I don't want to turn this into some other thing other than it is, but just look at the facts here. There was other places on the planet, they were flourishing, they were doing well, but we don't see that in the Bible, and the Bible is a storyline of a huge portion of Western traditions, but it is not the complete and entire story. I know they tell us that, they told me that growing up in church, but I'm sorry, but they were propagandizing my brain. Anyway, back to the story. So here we go. At this particular time, and let's just call this the year zero, just for the sake of argument. And we're talking Gregorian calendar here. So it's around the year zero. The Roman Empire is massive, in full swing. It's doing its thing. It's doing its control freak thing. It's a control freak, because the people that are running it are control freaks, and this control freak thing has been going on for many centuries, thousands of years, quite frankly. So this is just the way it is, and it is one of the big empires, if not the biggest empire, just before the Dark Ages and things come crashing down. When I say just before, you got to understand something about when you're trying to look at history like this, as we're doing it right now. We need to think in terms of 100 years, not 4 years or 6 months, but 100-year periods, 200 years, maybe 500-year periods. That way we'll be able to get a good overview of what was going on. Because, see, knowing all of this stuff and me laying this story out for you, even though this is my story as I see it, me laying this story out for you is actually leading somewhere. We will see that as we go more into wisdom activists and see more things from wisdom activists. But it's actually leading somewhere. But we need to think, especially in this story, we need to begin to think in terms of centuries rather than, well, that was long 5 years, wasn't it? It's not some time period of the administration. That's how politicians in America think. But no, that's not it. We the people. We the people. We the people need to actually become more enlightened, because a lot of that has been robbed from us. So let's take it back, shall we? So it's about the year zero. We'll just say it's about the year zero. And the Roman Empire's in full swing, and then, we have the influence of the Jesus Christ personage being born on the planet, and then all the stuff that came after that in those short few decades of Jesus Christ. I mean, it was a huge influence. Huge influence. So let's look at it from that perspective. If you grew up in the tradition, you know how huge the influence was, actually. And we're going to look very much deeper at the influence when we get later into the story. We're going to go into times much closer to our times. And those times that influenced us, especially from the European traditions, with their monarchies and their power structures and their feudalism and all of that stuff. We're going to look at that too, because this is all sort of the paradigm idea, you see. The paradigm idea is a very potent thing to see clearly. To see it clearly is a very potent thing to know, because you can see things clearly a certain way and you can actually do something about it. Okay? So what we're going to say is we're just going to say this for our storyline. We're going to say, okay, this time around the year 0 and into the end of the Roman Empire, the influence of the Jesus Christ. When I say that, I'm talking about the whole personage. And if you grew up in that tradition, you know what I mean. If you didn't, it probably won't matter to you anyway. It had a tremendous influence on the future. It had a tremendous influence on the empire. It had a tremendous influence on everything. It was incredibly potent. I mean, massively potent. It was so potent, it's still potent to this day. That was the potency of it. It was massive. It did a lot of stuff. Now, let's fly through history. Let's pop into the Dark Ages, because I want you to see something here. In the Dark Ages, when the Roman Empire fell, okay, when it finally crumbled away over the next few centuries, then we fall into the period of the Dark Ages. And the period of the Dark Ages, reading and writing is just, it doesn't exist. Education, as we think of education, doesn't exist. People are just existing. They're just like, okay, we just have to survive. And this goes on for hundreds of years. Hundreds of years. But in those hundreds of years period, let me draw this point out. In those hundreds of years period when the people were just like that, we have to ask ourselves this. Given that you now have these two paradigms and they're running side by side, how is it that the people got into this condition? How did they get in this position? Well, because what they were being indoctrinated with, what they were being propagandized by, what they were being educated with was not the real thing of stuff they should have been knowing. Had it been, all of these things would not have fallen away. We would not have plunged the populations. In other words, we, the people of these different nations, would not have been plunged into the Dark Ages, where everything just became completely broken down. It wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have happened, but it did happen, because those two paradigms were running. You had the paradigm of the ruling class, who were the people that were like, everything is mine, all the resources are mine, you people belong to me, you're my slaves, and I'm going to teach you how to be good slaves. Here, we're going to educate you for generations in this kind of thinking, because this is what we say is the right way to think. Well, it is the right way to think, so they can keep the populations in subjugation. It was very much the right way to think. But as you can see, when the empire came crumbling down, because the people were thinking like that, here's the Dark Ages. It goes on for centuries. In fact, it goes on for many, many centuries. It goes into the feudal system. That's when they had kings and stuff in Europe. It goes into the period leading into the Enlightenment period, which is much closer to our time. And we should probably pause while we're flying through time like this and look at the Enlightenment period, because that was a new paradigm popping up. And actually that new paradigm that was popping up actually in some ways was influenced by that period of the year zero, by that guy born in the Roman Empire named Jesus Christ. It just was influenced by that. But this was a paradigm shift was about to happen. It was in the Enlightenment period, and the paradigm shift was about to happen, and that leads to a whole bunch of stuff that we're going to look at coming up real quick here. So for our purposes, we should probably call this the end of part one of this story, because what we're going to look at next is going to be a little different. We're going to call that part two. I don't think I'm going to write it up that way on the website, but for those that are actually listening to the story, understand that this idea, the explanation that came until this point, was part one, and then we're going to look at some different things in part two. Okay, so let's do it like that.